The call came earlier than planned, and the moment the phone lit up, a quiet alarm went off inside her chest. It wasn't anything her daughter said exactly, it was how fast she said it, how rushed, how eager to end the conversation. The kind of tone that told you something was being skipped over on purpose. She hung up staring at the screen for several seconds, listening to the silence in her kitchen, that old familiar silence that had settled into her life years ago and never quite left. For weeks now, her granddaughter's visits had grown shorter, more irregular, always explained away with work schedules and stress and exhaustion. Reasonable excuses, sensible ones. But instincts don't care about logic. They whisper anyway. And that whisper had been growing louder. By the time she grabbed her coat and keys, she wasn't fully sure why she was leaving. She told herself she just wanted to check in, just a quick visit, just to see that everything was fine with her own eyes. The sky over rural Ohio was pale and overcast as she drove, fields blurring past the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The house came into view long before she reached the driveway, and her stomach tightened instantly. The lawn was overgrown, not wild in a charming way, but neglected, uneven, the kind of neglect that suggested no one had really looked at it in a long time. Curtains were drawn shut despite the daylight. Newspapers lay scattered near the mailbox, yellowed and curled. She sat in the car for a moment, heart thudding, telling herself she was overreacting. Old people forget things. Busy people fall behind. None of that meant danger. None of that meant panic. But when she stepped onto the porch and knocked, and no one answered, that whisper inside her became a shout. The door finally opened, slowly, revealing an elderly man she barely recognized as the person she'd met years ago at family gatherings. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, his eyes unfocused, like he was searching her face for context he couldn't quite find. He smiled uncertainly, said the wrong name, corrected himself, laughed it off as if it were nothing. "She's upstairs," he said eventually, stepping aside. "They're playing." The smell inside the house hit her next. Stale air. Old dishes. Something forgotten. Her eyes scanned the room automatically, mail piled everywhere, objects placed where they didn't belong. Her pulse quickened. She asked to see the child. He waved it off casually, repeating that it was just a game, that kids loved games like this. She didn't wait for permission. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. Halfway up, she heard it. A soft sound at first. A whimper. Then unmistakable crying, muffled, scared, the kind that doesn't belong to tantrums or bedtime protests. The kind that comes from fear. Her hand shook as she reached the door. Inside, the room was dim, curtains pulled tight. Her granddaughter was pressed into the corner, clutching a stuffed animal with white knuckles, her small body trembling. Tears streaked her face. Her eyes were wide, locked on something moving slowly in the center of the room. An old man, partially covered by a white sheet, arms stretched out, shuffling forward, his voice low and distorted beneath the fabric as he called out a name that was not the child's. In that instant, instinct took over. "Nosotros. No hesitación." She crossed the room in seconds, scooped the child into her arms, felt the tiny body cling to her like she was drowning. The crying turned desperate, breathless. The man pulled the sheet away, confusion etched across his face, genuinely startled by the reaction. He insisted it was just a game. That he used to play it all the time. That the little girl loved it. But the child was shaking. Hiding her face. Whispering through sobs that she was scared, that she wanted to go home, that he kept calling her by another name and telling her to be quiet. They were out the door moments later. Hands trembling, she strapped the child into the back seat, her mind racing, images replaying over and over. The dark room. The wrong name. The confusion in his eyes. The terror in hers. She sat behind the wheel, engine running, phone heavy in her hand. She knew what this would cause. Arguments. Accusations. Blame. She knew no one would thank her for what she was about to do. But she also knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was happening inside that house, whatever was happening inside that man's mind, a child was not safe there. Her thumb hovered only a second before pressing the numbers. The police cars did not arrive immediately, and those minutes felt longer than the drive itself. She stayed inside the vehicle, doors locked, engine idling, one hand resting on the steering wheel while the other reached back again and again to touch the child's knee through the gap between the seats. The little girl had stopped crying but had gone frighteningly quiet, staring out the window at the house as if afraid it might move closer on its own. The dispatcher's calm voice asked questions she struggled to answer clearly. Was anyone hurt? Had there been threats? Was the man violent? Each question felt too small for what she had seen. How do you explain fear without bruises? How do you explain danger when it wears the face of confusion? She watched the front door of the house the entire time, half expecting it to open again, half terrified that it wouldn't. When the patrol cars finally turned onto the street, relief and dread washed over her at the same time. The officers were polite, professional, careful. They listened as she spoke, her words tumbling over each other as she described the room, the sheet, the wrong name, the child's reaction. Saying it out loud made it sound thinner somehow, less solid than it felt in her bones. She hated that. She hated how easily fear could be dismissed when it didn't come with obvious proof. One officer went to the door while the other stayed with her, kneeling slightly to speak to the child. Gentle questions. Soft tone. The girl clutched her grandmother's sleeve and answered in whispers, eyes darting nervously toward the house. Inside, time stretched again. When the officers finally returned, their expressions were serious but restrained. They explained that the man was confused, yes, disoriented about the day and time, unclear about certain details, but not aggressive. He believed he had been playing. There were no signs of physical harm. The house was messy but not immediately unsafe. They would file a report. They would recommend a welfare check. They would follow up. Not today. The words landed like a weight. Not today. As if danger only counted once it crossed a certain invisible line. As if fear had to wait its turn. She nodded. She thanked them. She understood the limits of what they could do, even as frustration burned quietly in her chest. When they left, the street returned to stillness, the house unchanged, the curtains still drawn. Her phone rang almost immediately. Her daughter's voice was sharp before she even said hello. Accusations poured through the speaker. Why did you call the police? Do you know what you've done? He's terrified. He doesn't understand. You embarrassed everyone. She tried to explain. She described the child's tears, the darkness, the wrong name. The response was immediate and cold. Kids cry. Old people forget. You overreacted. Each word cut deeper than the last. When the call ended, the silence felt heavier than before. The child shifted in her seat, finally speaking, asking in a small voice if the man was in trouble. Even now, even after being frightened, she was worried about him. That broke something open inside her. She drove home slowly, replaying everything, questioning herself and then rejecting the doubt just as quickly. She knew what she had seen. She knew what she had felt. And she knew something else too. This wasn't over. Whatever was happening inside that house wasn't a one-time mistake. It wasn't bad judgment or clumsiness or harmless forgetfulness. It was something deeper, something that would not fix itself simply because everyone wanted it to. And if no one else was willing to look closely, she would. The house felt too quiet once they returned. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that presses against your ears and makes every thought louder than it should be. She made the child a small snack, poured juice into a plastic cup, forced her hands to move steadily even though her chest still felt tight. The girl sat at the table swinging her legs slightly, eyes down, unusually subdued for someone her age. Normally she would chatter non-stop. Stories about cartoons, about bugs in the yard, about imaginary friends and half-remembered dreams. That afternoon, she barely spoke. Her phone vibrated again. This time, her daughter was already on the way. The words hadn't been loud, but they carried weight. Finality. The kind that doesn't invite discussion. She knew the argument was coming, felt it settling into her bones before the car even pulled into the driveway. When the door opened, the tension rushed in with her. Her daughter's face was tight with exhaustion and anger, eyes rimmed red, jaw clenched as if holding everything together by force alone. She didn't greet her mother. She went straight for her child, checking her over quickly, hands moving fast, searching for marks that weren't there. "We're leaving," she said flatly. Her mother stood slowly, already bracing herself. "We need to talk." "No," her daughter snapped. "You need to stop." The words hung between them, sharp and unforgiving. She tried again. She spoke calmly, deliberately, explaining what she had seen, what the child had said in the car, how scared she had been. She chose her words carefully, avoiding exaggeration, sticking to facts. The dark room. The sheet. The wrong name. The crying. Her daughter shook her head before she even finished. "You called the police," she said. "You involved them without talking to me. Do you have any idea what that does to people? To families?" "I tried to call you," her mother replied quietly. "You didn't answer. That doesn't give you the right." Her voice cracked on the last word, anger slipping into something closer to panic. She paced the small living room, running a hand through her hair. "He's old," she continued. "He forgets things sometimes. That doesn't make him dangerous. That doesn't make him a monster." "I never said he was," her mother answered. "I said something isn't right." The child watched from the couch, eyes moving back and forth between them, fingers twisting the straw of her juice box. Her mother noticed and lowered her voice, but the damage was already there. Children hear everything. Even what isn't said. Her daughter stopped pacing and finally turned, eyes blazing. "You don't get it," she said. "I'm doing this alone. I work all day. I can't afford daycare. I don't have help. He's the only person who's been willing to watch her without charging me more than I make in a week." "I can help," her mother said immediately. The laugh that followed was bitter, hollow. "You're 72, her daughter shot back. "You get winded walking upstairs. What happens if she runs? What happens if there's an emergency? I can't risk that." The words stung more than she expected. Not because they were entirely untrue, but because of what they implied. That she was no longer capable. That her concern came from loneliness rather than reason. That her instincts had expired along with her youth. "I'm not useless," she said softly. Her daughter looked away, guilt flickering briefly before being buried under fatigue. "I didn't say that," she muttered. "I said I can't do this. Not now. Not with everything else." Silence fell again, heavy and unresolved. Finally, her daughter took the child's hand and moved toward the door. The girl hesitated, turning back for just a moment, eyes uncertain. "Grandma," she whispered. Her heart ached. "I'll call you," her daughter said sharply, pulling the door open. "But not right now. I need space." The door closed. The car pulled away. She stood there long after the sound of the engine faded, staring at the empty room, the juice box still half full on the table. The house felt bigger suddenly. Emptier. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dim bedroom again. Heard the wrong name. Saw confusion where there should have been clarity. Fear where there should have been safety. She questioned herself, the way everyone else had. Maybe she'd made it worse. Maybe she'd overstepped. Maybe she'd broken something that couldn't be repaired. But beneath the doubt, something steady remained. She knew what denial looked like. She'd lived with it once before, watching her husband hide pain behind jokes, watching neighbors look away because it was easier than getting involved. She knew the cost of waiting until things became undeniable. By morning, the decision had settled firmly in her chest. If her daughter wouldn't listen, if the system moved too slowly, if everyone else was too tired or too busy or too afraid to see what was happening, then she would keep looking. She would ask questions. She would pay attention. Because sometimes being right doesn't feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like standing alone, holding the truth, while everyone else turns away. She didn't go back the next day. Or the day after. At first, she told herself it was because her daughter needed space, because pushing too hard would only deepen the divide that had already opened between them. But the truth was less generous. She was afraid. Afraid of what she might confirm if she kept looking. Afraid that if she proved herself right, there would be no turning back. 3 days passed in a slow, aching rhythm. She woke up too early, checked her phone too often, jumped at every vibration that turned out to be nothing. Nights were worse. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the same images replaying themselves without mercy. The dark room. The sheet. The voice using a name that didn't belong to a living child. On the 4th morning, she stopped waiting. She drove back toward the neighborhood, but this time she didn't turn into the familiar driveway. Instead, she parked down the street and sat there for a moment, watching. The house looked the same as before. Curtains still drawn. Lawn still untouched. Nothing about it suggested urgency, and that frightened her more than chaos would have. She chose the nearest house with flowers in the window and forced herself to step out of the car. The woman who answered the door was polite, cautious at first, the way people are when they sense trouble but don't yet know its shape. She introduced herself simply, explained that she was worried about the man next door and wanted to know if anyone else had noticed changes. The woman's expression shifted almost immediately. "Oh," she said quietly. "Yes." That single word loosened something in her chest. The neighbor spoke in a hushed voice, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. She described seeing him outside in the middle of the afternoon wearing pajamas, standing motionless in the yard. She talked about calling his name and getting no response, about watching him wander down the street one evening until her husband walked him home because he seemed unsure where he lived. "I didn't want to interfere," the woman admitted. "You never know these days. People get offended. Families get angry." She thanked her and moved on to the next house. Then the next. The stories were different in detail but identical in meaning. Repetition. Confusion. Moments where he seemed entirely present, followed by stretches where he was clearly lost. One neighbor mentioned seeing him try to get into a car that wasn't his. Another talked about finding mail stuffed into the wrong boxes, weeks old, never opened. No one had called for help. Not because they didn't care, but because caring felt complicated. Risky. Easier to assume someone else would handle it. She drove home with her hands shaking, the weight of confirmation pressing down harder than uncertainty ever had. That afternoon, she went to the public library. The building smelled like paper and dust and quiet persistence. A young librarian helped her use the computer, her fingers moving slowly over the keyboard as she typed his name. Article after article appeared, each one a glimpse into a man she realized she had never truly known. Photographs showed him younger, standing proudly in classrooms, smiling beside students, holding plaques and awards. Headlines praised his dedication, his patience, his gift for making history feel alive. Former colleagues described him as gentle, brilliant, endlessly kind. She scrolled until her breath caught. An obituary. A teenage girl. His daughter. Died decades ago in a car accident. Her name jumped off the screen and struck with cruel clarity. The same name he had used in that dark room. Her hand trembled as she printed the page. Then another. And another. This wasn't malice. It wasn't neglect in the way people like to imagine neglect. It was memory folding in on itself. A mind slipping backward, grabbing the past and mistaking it for the present. A man reliving moments that once held joy, unaware that time had moved on without him. The realization brought no relief. Only sorrow. That evening, she made one more call. The voice on the other end was guarded at first, cautious, the way adult children often sound when confronted with concern about aging parents. She introduced herself carefully, explained her connection, and then spoke plainly. There was a long silence. Finally, the man sighed. Not in surprise, but in something closer to resignation. "I've noticed things," he admitted. "We all have. We just hoped it wasn't serious." She closed her eyes. Hope. The most dangerous delay of all. They talked for a long time. About forgotten meals. About phone calls that made no sense. About excuses stacked carefully on top of fear. He promised to come soon. He promised to look into doctors and evaluations. His voice carried guilt, but also distance, the kind that comes from living far away and believing love can survive absence. When the call ended, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the printed articles spread out before her. She understood it now, fully and painfully. The real danger had never been the man himself. It was the quiet agreement everyone had made not to see him fading. Not to ask hard questions. Not to act until something truly terrible forced their hand. And she knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that if she stopped now, if she stepped back and waited politely, the next call might come too late. So she made another decision. She would go back. Not as an accuser. Not as an angry grandmother. But as someone willing to see him clearly, for who he was now, and who he was losing himself to be. Because pretending nothing was wrong had already proven far more dangerous than the truth. She returned to his house late in the afternoon, when the light was softer and shadows stretched long across the street. This time, she parked directly in front instead of hiding down the block. There was no reason to sneak anymore. Fear had already done enough damage. If she was going to step back into that house, she needed to do it honestly. She held the printed pages against her chest as she walked up the cracked driveway. Newspaper bundles still lay untouched near the mailbox. The same curtains remained closed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She knocked gently. For a moment, she wondered if he wouldn't answer at all. Then she heard movement inside, slow and uneven. The door opened only partway, and when he saw her, his eyes widened with something close to panic. "Did you bring the police?" he asked quietly. The question alone told her how deeply the fear had settled into him. "No," she said immediately. "It's just me. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." He hesitated, fingers gripping the edge of the door as if it were the only thing holding him upright. Finally, he stepped aside. The house looked worse than before. More dishes in the sink. More mail scattered across every surface. A faint burnt smell hung in the air, the kind that suggested a forgotten stove burner or a meal left too long unattended. He moved slowly, carefully, like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. They sat across from each other in the living room. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she asked the question no one else had dared to ask him directly. "How are you really doing?" He laughed weakly at first, brushing it off with a shrug, but his hands betrayed him, trembling slightly in his lap. The laughter faded. His shoulders slumped. "I think I'm losing pieces," he said quietly. "Little ones at first. Names. Dates. Then bigger ones." She didn't interrupt. She let the silence give him space. "I wake up and don't remember if I've eaten," he continued. "Sometimes I find plates in the sink and I don't recognize them. Other times I drive somewhere and don't know why I went. I just end up there." His voice cracked. "And sometimes," he added, barely above a whisper, "I see her." She knew exactly who he meant. "I know she's gone," he said quickly, as if afraid she might misunderstand. "I know that. Somewhere in my head, I know it. But then there are moments when it feels so real. Like she's just in the other room. Like I only need to call her name." Tears welled in his eyes, and he wiped them away angrily, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to scare that little girl," he said. "I swear I didn't. I thought I was playing. I thought I was making her laugh. I thought—" His voice broke completely then, and the rest of the sentence dissolved into silence. She reached across the space between them and took his hands. They felt cold. Fragile. "You're not a bad person," she said gently. "You're not doing this on purpose." He nodded slowly, but fear still clung to his expression. "They're going to lock me away," he said. "That's what happens, isn't it? You forget things and people decide you're done. That you're already gone." "No," she said firmly. "What happens is you get help. But only if people know you need it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, eyes searching. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I don't want to disappear." The words settled heavily between them. Later that night, she made the calls she had been avoiding. She spoke to his sons again, this time without softening anything. She described the tremors in his hands, the confusion in his stories, the fear in his voice. She told them about the burnt smell, the unopened mail, the question he'd asked at the door. There was no arguing this time. No minimizing. By the weekend, they came. The house filled with voices again, strained and awkward at first, guilt thick in the air. His sons looked older than she remembered, weighed down by the realization that they had waited too long. The conversation was painful, defensive, emotional. But it happened. On Monday morning, they took him to a clinic. The waiting room was quiet, sterile, filled with people staring at walls and floors, each lost in their own version of fear. He sat stiffly, hands folded, eyes darting every time a door opened. When the nurse called his name, he flinched. The evaluation took hours. Memory tests. Questions about dates and places. Simple tasks that suddenly weren't simple at all. She watched from across the room as frustration crept into his posture, as answers slipped through his fingers no matter how hard he tried to hold on to them. When the doctor finally spoke, the room felt smaller. The diagnosis came gently, professionally, but no amount of kindness could soften its weight. Moderate Alzheimer's. Progressing. Not reversible. He closed his eyes as if bracing for a blow. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him. "Am I dangerous?" The doctor shook her head. "No. But you are vulnerable. And you need care." Care. The word landed differently than punishment would have. Plans followed. Hard ones. Selling the house. Memory care. Supervision. Safety. Each decision felt like a small loss, but also a step away from something worse. That evening, she sat alone again, exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She knew the next conversation would be the hardest of all. Telling her daughter that she had been right hadn't felt like victory. It felt like grief. Because no one wins when the truth arrives late. She waited until evening to call her daughter, choosing the hour carefully, knowing exhaustion softened anger in ways daylight never could. When the call connected, there was a pause on the other end, a guarded silence that spoke of unfinished hurt. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. There was a sigh. "Make it quick." So she did not start with the diagnosis. She did not start with being right. She started with fear. She told her about the way his hands shook when he asked if the police were coming back. About how he sat on the edge of his chair like a child waiting to be punished. About how he admitted he didn't always know if he had eaten, or where he had been, or why his memories kept slipping sideways into decades that no longer existed. Then she told her the truth. "He thought your daughter was his," she said softly. "Not you. His little girl. The one he lost." The silence on the line stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. Finally, her daughter spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew something was wrong." The confession came out in pieces. Late-night phone calls where he asked for people who had been dead for years. The way he sometimes seemed surprised to see her when she came to pick up her child. The moments she had explained away because she couldn't afford not to. Because denial was cheaper than daycare. Because exhaustion makes terrible bargains feel reasonable. "I didn't want to see it," she admitted. "I couldn't." There was no accusation in her mother's response. Only understanding. "They diagnosed him," she said. "Alzheimer's. It's been progressing for years." Her daughter broke down then, the sound raw and unfiltered. Guilt poured through the phone, mixed with relief so sharp it hurt. Relief that there was a name for it. Relief that she hadn't imagined the unease. Relief that her child was safe. They cried together, miles apart, bound by the same realization. That love without awareness can still cause harm. That good intentions do not stop time from stealing what it wants. In the weeks that followed, life rearranged itself slowly and painfully. The house was sold. The rooms emptied of history. Photographs packed into boxes, memories reduced to objects others would decide the value of. He moved into a memory care facility just outside town, a small place with a garden and locked doors and staff trained to speak gently when reality slipped. Some days he knew where he was. Some days he didn't. The first time she visited him there, he smiled politely, unsure of her name but grateful for her presence. He talked about teaching. About students who no longer existed. About a daughter whose face was forever 4 years old in his mind. He was calmer there. Safer. Her granddaughter adjusted in her own way. She drew pictures for him. She asked fewer questions over time. The fear faded, replaced by a careful kindness that only children seem capable of. When she asked why he lived somewhere else now, the answer was simple. "He's sick," her grandmother told her. "And now he has help." Home changed too. The quiet house filled again with footsteps and laughter and small routines. Toys appeared in corners. Snacks vanished from cabinets. Her daughter came by more often, tired but softer, no longer carrying everything alone. One evening, as they sat together watching the child play on the floor, her daughter spoke without looking up. "You didn't ruin anything," she said. "You saved her. And him." Her mother said nothing. She didn't need to. Later, after bedtime, she stood by the window, listening to the wind move through the trees, thinking about how close they had come to a different ending. One shaped not by cruelty, but by neglect. Not by monsters, but by people stretched too thin to notice what was breaking right in front of them. She understood now that being the one who speaks up often means being the one everyone resents first. That protection doesn't always look gentle. that sometimes love demands discomfort. The next morning, she would visit him again. She would bring a photo, sit beside him, listen to the stories that no longer followed time in order. And she would keep doing what she had done from the beginning. Pay attention. Because the most dangerous thing in this world is not illness or age or confusion. It is silence. And she had learned at last that breaking it was worth the cost.